We're going to talk about communication and culture. In the past lectures, we always talk about how our communication affects our identity and how communication uh, is heavily involved in using symbols, and at the same time how these symbols represent an idea, or how these symbols can actually help change. Now we will also look at how communication affects the development of culture, or a development of a culture, and how is culture communicated through communication or different communication forms, how culture is communicated through different media, and how media is actually shaping or reshaping culture, and what now can we expect in culture today, especially in the growing age of communication. The agenda for the agenda for this lecture is to first differentiate communication in high context and low context cultures. Next is to analyze verbal and nonverbal codes in different intercultural situations. Third is to discuss how issues and barriers in effective intercultural communication can be addressed through intercultural praxis. Next is to explain the concept of the third space and its importance in intercultural communicative settings. And finally, to analyze Filipino communicative behaviors. So here we are actually dealing with the problem, or a concern, that whenever we try to communicate, especially to those who are in other cultures, we have a problem of understanding. It's not just simply talking to them or interacting with those people, but it's more of how how can we effectively and appropriately connect to those people? How can we actually reach out to those people? And for that, we need to understand their culture in order to create effective messages, in order um, to express in order for them to express their identity, and for them to be satisfied in communication, and also in order for to have a better representation and to use symbols more effectively. So here we will discuss that on this lecture. So we need to establish first that culture is communication, and that culture influence that in other words, culture influences communication because communication is shaped by deeply held cultural values and beliefs. So the way we communicate, the way we use language, the way we express our identity or even our identity, and uh, the way we craft effective messages are all influenced, are all shaped by our culture. And the way we show our culture is through communication. We cannot actually show the, our culture, we cannot actually show our traditions, our values without the use of communication, without the use of different symbols, without the use of language. We cannot act, we cannot actually show our identity in our culture if we do not use effective communication. And that is why culture influences communication, and also communication influences the development of culture. So let's go first to our first objective, which is the difference between the high context cultures and low context cultures, or high context communication and uh, low context communication. Here, context matters, and our communication style is actually shaped by our culture. That is why we need to understand the culture of the one we're talking to in order to understand them. So we need to understand culture first before understanding the group or even the person or the communication or the interaction itself. So so here, we will try to differentiate between high context communication and low context communication. In high context communication, it assumes that the people who are interacting are familiar with each other and the communication situation and can rely on implicit and nonverbal cues to communicate with and understand each other. So when we try to look at intercultural communication, we always consider factors such as the concepts or the notions of time, space, and relationships of the group or the people that we're interacting with. And when we look at the context of our interactions, though because these are embedded in their messages, and that is why when we try to look at high context communication, it is we actually look at the indirect and the implicit communication styles that people use. So the more that we see that people use indirect communication, the more people use nonverbal cues, and the more that people are interacting implicitly, it is we consider that has as high context communication. So when we talk about low context communication, we actually go with more explicit and detailed communication, and that means it is more the communication the interactions are more verbal. The information is very direct. The message is spelled out, and it is very explicit. So verbal messages are valued more than the nonverbal. So in high context, we value we value more on the nonverbal codes, while on the low context communication, we value more on the verbal codes. So as stated earlier, context is shaped by a culture's notion of time, space, and relationships. So in high context cultures, families tend to close knit and there is centralized social structure, and they actually share communal spaces and can tolerate narrower personal spaces. In terms of time, time is understood to be fluid and not fixed, and a process that belongs to others and nature. While in low context cultures, our relationships are more formal and also brief. So when it comes to high context communication, when we talk about relationships, it's more of a informal relationships, and anyone can actually interact with each other. But here, in low context cultures, relationships are very formal and also brief, and there is also a stronger sense of individuality compared to high context cultures uh, where people value more collective uh, anything that is collective than individual. And in low context cultures, a social structure is decentralized, and personal space and privacy are also important. Hence, the space is compartmentalized, and an individual's time uh, is their own. Thus, events and tasks have defined schedules. So those are the difference between high context and low context communication. And these are needed because it is also one way for us to understand the culture or even the person that we're interacting with. So if the if the person that we're interacting with is more of a high context uh, belongs to a high context culture, we would be able to adjust our messages. We would be able to adjust our understanding when it comes to understanding the person or understanding the messages shared by the person, or uh, when the person is a low belongs to a low context culture, we would be able to be more formal with our messages or with our or when developing relationships. So uh, it's it's good to know it's good to know the context of the person that we're talking to, and it is very important in order to achieve effective communication, especially when we're interacting with different cultures. Speaking of the difference between high context communication and low context communication in terms of the use of verbal and nonverbal codes, we will also look deeper at verbal communication and uh, nonverbal communication. So another component of intercultural communication is the use of verbal and nonverbal symbols. And often, intercultural communication results in misunderstandings because participants in a communicative encounter operate on different sets of meanings, both with regard to the words that they speak and the nonverbal signals or expressions that are part of how they communicate. In other words, verbal communication and nonverbal communication varies. So people may sometimes prefer to be more verbal than nonverbal, while some people who can understand each other would be able to understand each other if they use more nonverbal codes or they incorporate more nonverbal and at the same time mix with verbal codes. So it also differs between different contexts or different or whether if the person is high context or part of the low context culture. So here we'll try to look at verbal communication. So verbal communication is actually the reception, storage, retrieval, manipulation, and generation of linguistic symbols. In other words, verbal communication simply means the use of words, the use of language. So uh, here, I will also talk about, I will also explain more about different verbal and also nonverbal cues deeper in another video. But here, but in this section, I will cover issues or misunderstandings due to verbal or nonverbal communication. And and in verbal communication, one issue or problem here or concern is the linguistic or the lexical comprehension, mishearing utterances, complexity of syntax or grammar, semantics or meaning of words. So when we talk about verbal communication, it's either linguistic or pragmatic or how the speaker uses words in a specific context. So these are some of the problems or concerns that we encounter whenever we talk to another culture. So sometimes it's because of the how they speak in a different grammar or how they speak with a different meaning. But sometimes it's also how the speaker uses words in a specific context. Sometimes it's the same word, but it has a different context. It has a different mean. It has a different context, and therefore it has a different meaning when it comes to communicating with a person, even though you speak in the same language. Next is nonverbal communication. So according to Samovar and Matsumoto and Wang, nonverbal communication refers to all actions which do not use words, or basically which do not use words. So nonverbal communications aims to express internal states, construct identities, to regulate interaction, to repeat the message, and to substitute for words. So these are some of the aims or objectives of using nonverbal communication. So sometimes it we use nonverbal communication such as gestures, paralanguage. We also use clothing or even the use of artifacts in order to show ourselves, to show who we are. Next is to regulate interaction. So it sometimes gestures show or will tell us when to start a conversation or even when to stop a conversation or a communication. We also use nonverbal communication in order to highlight the verbal message or even to repeat the important message or to emphasize something or to emphasize a part of the message that we want to say. And even we use nonverbal communication to substitute for words. So whenever people, for example, whenever people ask us, oh, which is the direction to this part, to this place, so we sometimes use our hands or fingers to tell them where they will go, or we sometimes use our nguso to show the direction like this or this, di ba? So here we look at nonverbal communication um, as a supplement, not just as a supplement for verbal communication, and at the same time, we use nonverbal communication in order to make the message more meaningful. So in a problem that we encounter whenever we use nonverbal communication, especially in communicating with other cultures, is that uh, culture plays a significant influence on nonverbal behavior by establishing expectations and norms that dictate the appropriateness of specific nonverbal displays. And that means if we do not understand the culture and their nonverbal codes, we won't be able to be more appropriate when it comes to communication. Sometimes gestures can be seen by other cultures as bad or a sign of disrespect. Sometimes we use gestures to be more polite, while some indicate or represent some or bad words or curses or cuss. So another thing is that nonverbal behaviors can also be ambiguous, especially if we use nonverbal behaviors more often than verbal behaviors. Sometimes, if we continue to use gestures without while speaking less, or if we actually use paralanguage without being more verbal when it comes to communicating with people, we would the meanings that we actually convey or the message that we actually convey is actually ambiguous. And and that means we need to understand that nonverbal behaviors are shaped by multiple factors, and it includes cultural universals and expressions or actions that are culturally distinctive or unique. And because of that, uh, if we continue to use nonverbal communication without the supplement of verbal communication, we won't be able to express it appropriately and also effectively. So the lesson here is that we need to have the balance on the use of nonverbal communication and verbal communication. So verbal communication should always be supplemented or complemented by uh, nonverbal communication, and nonverbal communication should be supplemented or complemented by verbal communication. So, understanding the verbal and nonverbal communication codes that differentiate cultures from each other is important in developing intercultural communication competence. And we are competent when it comes to intercultural communication. Uh, the use of nonverbal and verbal communication helps us to uh, to recognize the diversity among cultures and guide our actions in order to promote intercultural understanding. However, culture should not be understood as a monolithic concept or or something that is static or stable. Cultural variations or co-cultures exist within nations and communities, and the aforementioned verbal and nonverbal communication behaviors manifest differently among ethno-linguistic groups within a national boundary. So this is very applicable in the Philippine setting where we have different cultures, we have different people groups, and we may have similarities with each other, but of course, the use of verbal and nonverbal, the use of verbal and nonverbal codes still varies from one another. So analysis of communication across cultures should actually be sensitive to these inter and intracultural nuances. So here we must be sensitive not only in studying culture, but also how we interact with them. Uh, and and if we are not aware of the culture of the person or the group, we are not we are actually having a step backward when it comes to communicating sensitively or communicating appropriately or effectively. So now we will talk about different intercultural communication barriers. So we will expand more uh, on the problems aside from looking at the nonverbal and verbal communication. But we will also try to look at different intercultural barriers and how to how to overcome these barriers through intercultural communication uh, praxis. So aside from the clashes of meanings brought about by different cultural frameworks, there are bigger issues in intercultural communication that stem from a lack of understanding of other cultures. So these include anxiety, uh, as- assuming similarity instead of differences, ethnocentrism, ethnocentrism, having stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So we consider these to be bigger issues as they do not only stem from and result in misunderstood meanings. Rather, they impact negatively on relationships between cultures and, at their worst, may be the source of intercultural conflicts with serious socio-political consequences. So let's try to look at them one by one. So, anxiety is a state characterized by light to extreme feelings of worry, fear, and insecurity about meeting and interacting with individuals from a different cultural background. So, this is mainly due to uncertainties in intercultural encounters. And when we talk about our uncertainty, we actually deal with the knowledge of that group or that culture or that person. So the more that we come to know, the more that we would be able to understand and know the culture of the person, the less anxious and the less uncertain that we are when it comes to dealing and also communicating with that person. So whenever a person has anxiety when it comes to intercultural communication, the result is that the individual is not totally present in the communication transaction. So they become too conscious about making things right, or uh, it may result to the person not being able to listen properly or understand appropriately, and instead acts in a more awkward manner. So anxiety actually leads to awkwardness when it comes to intercultural interactions. The next is assuming similarity instead of difference. So when you assume similarity between cultures, you can actually be caught unaware of these important differences. So when you have no information about a new culture, it might make sense to assume that there are no differences and to behave that you would and to behave like as if you are you treat other cultures as your own culture. But we need to remember that each culture is unique and distinct and different to some degree. So if we continue to assume that other cultures are similar to ours, it will sometimes drive us to impose our way of thinking and doing things on others. So here we are actually imposing our culture to them and making them or forcing them to subscribe to our culture instead of feeling in to their shoes and understanding what they do or who they are. So this actually robs the interaction of its potential to develop an interesting intercultural relationship. The next barrier that we will talk about is ethnocentrism. So this refers to negatively judging aspects of another culture by the standards of one's own culture. So it actually coincides with stereotyping and prejudice and discrimination. So in stereotyping, we are actually having a widely held beliefs about a group of people. So we actually judge them, and even the connotation here is very negative. When it comes to prejudice, it is a negative attitude towards a cultural group based on little on or no experience or facts about it or knowledge about it. And finally, we have discrimination or the behavior that results from stereotyping or even prejudice. So here in discrimination, actions are more overt, and it and these actions are actually excluding, avoiding, or distancing ourselves from these groups or from these cultures. So, how do we actually overcome these intercultural barriers that we actually experience from every intercultural interaction? Sorrells actually put six points or six ways or what we call intercultural communication praxis uh, that will help us to overcome these intercultural communication barriers or to avoid these intercultural communication barriers. So let's go first with inquiry. So inquiry includes taking an interest in and making a commitment to learn about other cultures, which motivate engagement with other people. The next is framing, which is a continuum of perspective taking options. So our tendency is to consider first and foremost our perspectives and orientations when confronting the world. But Sorrells suggests that it might be better for us to acknowledge that our perspectives are constrained by our frames. And in order to overcome this, in order to remedy this, we need to educate ourselves about the local and global forces that influence intercultural interactions, like the histories of peoples, their way of life, their traditions, etc. Third is positioning. So, positioning is actually looking at not just our geographic situation or geographic position, but also our social and political positions. So, um, if we acknowledge that there is a not just geographical reality, but there's also political, social, and economic reality, we may be in a better position to recognize that people have different levels of access to resources, and lack of access uh, impact the realities of the people. So we may be able to acknowledge that some voices are dominant, or some voices are being silenced, or some voices are being marginalized. Next is to have dialogue. So in Sorrell's words, dialogue offers us opportunities to stretch ourselves, to reach across, to imagine, experience, and creatively engage with points of view, ways of thinking and being, and beliefs different from our own, while accepting that we may not fully understand or come to a common agreement or position. And the last two are reflection, which refers to the capacity for introspection and being able to modify one's views and behavior based on that reflection. And finally, action, which which establishes that we modify our thoughts and feelings in accordance with the ideals of cultural and political inclusiveness. And because of that, we must also take action to help promote a socially just, equitable, and even a peaceful world. So, how do we how do we actualize the intercultural communication praxis? how do we do this? Where can we do this? So here we are actually looking at the concept of the third space, which individuals from different cultures who interact with each other make adjustments to their own sense of cultural identity in order to explore new ways of building relationships. Here, when we talk about third space, we not only look at the commonalities of different cultures, of our own culture and the culture of the person we're interacting with, but we are also trying to create a new space for us to look at our commonalities and also to develop our relationships with each other and also to try um, to sort out our differences and even to strengthen our commonalities and our relationships. So we now go to Filipino communication. We it is said that among all Asians, Filipinos are the most westernized due to the due to colonization, and the American influence in particular is readily apparent in our country, from American shops to fast foods and to also different form of entertainment and media. So there is also the Filipinos' use of American English, and later on we have come to develop this kind of English into Filipino English. So it is also so English is actually one of the languages that we commonly speak here in this country, and this lecture is actually being delivered in the medium of the English language. So many expressions are used in social media and even in traditional media and even in our daily interactions and in everyday conversations among our fellow countrymen are very westernized or particularly American. So, however, the Americanized Filipino culture, according to Melba Magay, is only an external appearance and may not accurately reflect the entirety of the Filipino culture. So, Filipinos still have an internal culture which can be difficult uh, to understand from a Western standpoint. And that means it is still, we can actually show our distinctiveness uh, when it comes to American culture. And the Filipino way of communicating can be confusing for many foreigners. So while Americans, for example, might prefer a more direct and straightforward manner of exchanging information, or in other words, low context cultures, Filipinos tend to communicate through pakikiramdam or pagpapaligoy-ligoy or pagpapahiwatig, which is actually considered to be a high context communication. And these are actually implicit connections between two speakers. So in other words, using the framework of Stuart Hall's high context and low context communication, Filipinos tend to engage in high context communication. So, in the previous sections in our lecture, we learned that people from high context cultures communicate through context dependent nonverbal codes and meanings that are implicitly shared both by the speaker and the listener, whereas a low context culture prefers a more literal and explicit exchange of uh, information. So according to Melba Magay, our long history of communal relationship has resulted in a heightened sensitivity and shared understanding in which messages need not always be expressed in words, but can be conveyed through nonverbal cues that are understood by both the speaker and listener. But however, in countries like United States, where societies are more atomized, centralized, and than rather than communal, it is important that messages are explicitly stated and are expressed in a straightforward manner to avoid confusion. So it should be noted, however, that there is no single homogeneous Filipino culture. We need to remember that we are a diverse uh, archipelago and we have diverse cultures. And each of them have their own ways of living and understanding of the world. So, even if we have the same language, or even if people speak the same language, such as the use of Tagalog, they have still different versions or dialects, or what we call dialects, when it comes to speaking the language, and that reflects their culture, that reflects their way of life. And actually, when we look at the number of languages in our country, we have more than 150 languages. We have more than 150 languages, and this number is an indicator of the differences and diversity in cultures in the country. So what should we do? Um, we should be able to be more aware in characterizing Filipino communication behaviors. As a matter of fact, intercultural communication may transpire even between Filipinos talking to one another. So, for example, a Filipino Muslim woman from Mindanao and a teenage Filipino urban dweller, although both can speak the Filipino language and are both Filipinos, they might have a different understanding of the world and also have a distinct set of communication behaviors. Nevertheless, the concepts presented in, in our lecture for Filipino communication are attempts by Filipino scholars such as Lacson and Magay to distinguish our unique way of communicating on the basis of history, our culture, our psyche, and our language as a people. So, we actually look at Laxon's Laxon's Filipino communicative behaviors. So according to Laxon, the Filipino communicative behaviors are concepts of awareness, knowledge, attitude, values, beliefs, opinions, tendencies, predispositions, practices, and perceptions relating to communication behavior of Filipinos. So for Laxon, mindsets are predeterminants to communicative behavior and stem from people's traditions, values, and belief systems, and the shared experience of a social and natural environment. So he actually observed that there are mindsets that are relevant to Filipino communicative behavior, and those are first deprivation deservation syndrome. So this actually refers to people's thinking that they deserve something because they are deprived of something. So one example of this is the word sayang and libre. So we Filipinos don't want to pass up opportunities, especially things uh, that are free or accessible to us. The next is the kulang sa pansin or syndrome and the quest for ownership and credit seeking. So this refers to the need for recognition, attention, and being or feeling understood. So concepts related to this include wanting to get credit, crab mentality, and also the panglalamang. Third is having the convenience approach to living on. So this refers to the inclination towards the most convenient and easiest way to get things done and achieve goals. It includes asking other persons to do tasks on one's behalf or or uh, doing favors, which explains why there are fixers um, in our system. Next is having the sense of humor. So this mindset enables people to cope with hardships in life and uh, gives them relief from hard work. So it is actually an indication of a pragmatic worldview where there is hopefulness but also an awareness of the limitations and uh, the limitations of the people, but then these are creatively crafted in order to have uh, light, a lighter and also a fun point of view or a fun perspective. And finally, the concept of accountability. And this has to do with the tendency to evade accountability through palusot or by blaming others for their mistakes. Here, when we talk about the accountability, Filipinos actually avoid being accountable, and that is why there is a tendency for them um, to to have hugas kamay, the concept of hugas kamay, or or to make palusot or to make excuses or even to find a scapegoat whenever there is something wrong about what they do. Now we go to the indigenous Filipino ways of interpersonal communication by Mel Damagay. So Mel Damagay studied the cross-cultural flow of communication among Filipinos in order to understand and even to illustrate our unique ways of communication. So Magay looked into native words in various Philippine languages and also studied different cultural records and practices of Filipinos. So her work is actually came from the framework of Psikolohiyang Filipino, which is more centered in in the concepts of loob and labas, which is others, or othering, and the concepts of uh, and also the concept of kapwa. So to recap from her study, Melba Maga identified the following indigenous Filipino ways of interpersonal communication. First is pagpapahiwatig. So pagpapahiwatig means getting a message across in an indirect manner, especially when the message is sensitive, embarrassing, or potentially offensive. So pahiwatig can also be verbal or non-verbal or a combination of the two. Next is mensaheng may tagapamagitan. So this means communication through a third party or through a mediator who serves as a bridge in order to avoid conflict. So here, some words that associate with tagapamagitan are pahatid, parating, pasabi, pabilin, and paabot. So here we are actually looking at that Filipinos are avoiding confrontation, and because of that, there is actually a need or a tendency that people would get a third party in order to act as a mediator when it comes to conflicts. Next is pagbubunyag, or which is bringing what is inside out to someone. And the related words here are ipagtapat or disclosing to an accountable or trusted person, ihinga, so more on relieving or disclosing our anxieties, our secrets, or our internal discomfort, or ilabas, or which is to disclose or reveal the information or expose what we know to the public, or ilahad. So it's more of also uh, reporting to a wider audience. Next is pagpapakitang giliw, or putting on a pleasant and gracious demeanor to create a good impression. So here we are more actually avoiding conflict, and at the same time we are actually being more polite when it comes to communicating, and we are actually more on presenting a good impression of ourselves. Next is paglalantad ng sarili, which is showing off or displaying haughtiness when presenting oneself or relating to others. So here is we actually some of the words that are actually associated with this are pagpaporma or pagiging bongga or pambobola. So often, this behavior elicits derision from other Filipinos. Next is tuwirang pagsasagutan. So this tuwirang pagsasagutan is actually argumentation in formal and in public events. So associated words here are balitaktakan, pagtatalo, or talastasan. So although this communication practice is confrontational, which is what I'm saying earlier, is that we try to avoid confrontations. Speakers are still careful with their word choice and as much as possible be more polite in order to create a good impression and at the same time to to have good relations with one another. So the flow of conversation is laden with detours and segues, and also and also direct disagreements are prefaced with apologetic disclaimers. So you can always say na sorry, no offense, but then you will try uh, to express your disagreements. So here we can, even though this is a confrontational act, we are still trying to avoid confrontation in order to have a good relations with one another. Next is pagsisiwalat ng mga pansariling impormasyon, which in other words, revelation of private information to the public are reflecting the lack of the concept of privacy and the blurring of the line that separates information for a trusted circle and for the public. So here, the concept of chismis is actually uh, um, is actually uh, covered in this part where we Filipinos do not actually have a concept of privacy, or we actually lack the concept of privacy. So that is why we don't actually know how where is the boundary between sharing information or disclosing when it comes to disclosing information. Next is pakikipagsosyalan. So here is not actually being social or in Filipinos being extravagant, but here is we are engaging in social interaction, group conversation, and intimate conversations. Here, conversations are very important for Filipinos, whether it's a personal or intimate interactions, or it could be a collective or a group conversations. Next is pagbibigay ng balita or announcing or reporting news. So this includes pagpapahayag, pagpapaalam, pagpapaabot, pagpapatalastas, and pagbibigay ng babala. So here, uh, when we are actually a reporting type of people, and this actually reflects on our way how we do our chismis. We actually do it in a reporting manner or in a reporting way. And of course, most of the information that we share, we do it in a reporting way or in a manner of we are like announcing news to different people, whether to our partner, to someone, to a friend, to a family member, or even uh, to different types of people, or even to strangers. And finally, we have the katutubong retorika. So these are indigenous rhetorical forms or discourses such as balagtasan, balitaw, uh, putungan, ambahan, o gayam, or even bugtungan. So these are actually forms of a rhetoric or forms of communication. So we use this in order to communicate with people in a creative manner. So according to Magay, although it is true that implicit communication is prevalent in Filipino culture, which shows that we are a high context culture, there are also contexts that require direct and explicit communication or low context communication, such as when there is a high degree of social distance between the speaker and listener, or whenever we are using social media, and when the other person is an outsider rather than we consider them as one of us. So whenever we treat other people as others or an outsider, or whenever we talk to people in social media, we actually execute low context communication styles. So to end, while culture is dynamic, we should be able to, we should be actually critical of the kind of changes that are taking place and the influences that make these changes possible. Here we already understand how we can actually uh, communicate with other cultures through looking at or understanding the concepts of high context and low context communication, and at the same time, how we can use or effectively use verbal and nonverbal codes. And here we also look at how our culture, especially when it comes to communication. So here we saw that we are actually a high context culture, but we also use low context communication styles, such as being more explicit when it comes to distance interactions, or even when we um, try to to understand one another, or when we treat others as an outsider or an or part of the others. So we need to also recognize that our culture changes from time to time, and we can see here that we are actually affected or influenced by colonial mentalities, colonial notions, or colon, uh, colonial values and beliefs. And here, it is it has become embedded to our culture as Filipinos as well. And that is why we look at different Filipino communicative behaviors, and we also look at the indigenous Filipino ways of interpersonal communication. But at the same time, as we notice these changes, as we try to uh, appreciate the diversity and also uh, the dynamic nature of culture, we should be critical. We should still be critical on this kind of changes. And being critical means that we are not only aware of what is happening, or we are not only aware of our culture, but we are also knowing, we are also trying to make things right when it comes to making an appropriate and also an effective messages. So sometimes we are not saying that our culture is good. We are some of them are bad, are bad habits, or some of them can is needed to be changed or needed to be corrected. But at the same time, we are learning this in order for us to understand what we usually do. We understand, and in order for us to be more sensitive uh, when it comes to dealing with not just with our culture, but also to other cultures.